This year's academic forum is going to be different. It's a place to discuss and resolve academic issues dealing with education and research. It is not going to be a series of presentations by academics on topics of interest to themselves. It is not going to be a series of panels by panelists who discuss various perspectives but leave little time for audience participation. So, in session 0, this is the introduction and the rules of engagement. I'm saying that systems engineering is facing a Seldom crisis. I'll explain what a Seldom crisis is and what the Seldom crisis that we're facing is. Talk to you about the structure of the academic forum, the rules of engagement, and then we'll go straight into session 1. Now, how many of you have sat in on the Summit Forum this morning? And my opinion is they're building some wonderful sandcastles in midair. And I think somebody in INCOSE realized what I was going to say here today. So when I showed up for registration and they gave me my badge, they took away my fellows ribbon. Okay, Seldom crisis. It was Isaac Asimov in his novel Foundation who introduced the topic of the Seldom crisis. The Seldom crisis usually involves both an external pressure and an internal pressure, and both pressures will come to a head simultaneously and be resolved with the same action. And for any of you speakers who are standing here at the podium with your presentation, just make sure you get out of the way so the people sitting over here can see you. So here's the Seldom crisis in systems engineering as I see it. We have a lot of support for systems engineering, and you saw it this morning, and you heard the Minister and the Chief Defense Scientist talk. But I think in 1 to 5 years, the current international support in government and industry will begin to wane. And the reason for that is that cost and schedule overruns will continue unless we do something about it. And making a prediction like this puts me in a wonderful position, because if the prediction comes true, then I'm a wonderful prophet and I saw it going to happen and I told you about it. If it doesn't come true, then I get the credit for having prevented it. Win-win. So once the support begins to wane, if we don't do anything about it, systems engineering will be consigned to bad history in the manner of business process reengineering, TQM, management by objective, etc. Academic institution enrollments will go down. How many people here in academic institutions that teach systems engineering? That's your job. If the enrollments go down, George Mason is going to be okay, because I think that operations research might be the next fad, and your department is systems engineering and operations research. And when I was putting together some of this stuff, and I was looking to see, what do systems engineers do? What's the job of the systems engineer? I went to the US Government Bureau of Labor Statistics to see what they thought a systems engineer was, and they don't list systems engineer as a job. Now, that's the external threat. Internally, we still have a lack of consensus on a definition of systems engineering. We don't have a body of knowledge. We don't even have a structure for a body of knowledge. Systems engineering is having difficulty differentiating itself as a profession, and systems engineers are making things too complicated. And I generally show some Rube Goldberg cartoons when I talk about this. We don't have time at the moment. So, systems engineering. Systems engineering basically means whatever the speaker intended. So when Singapore says the success of Singapore was due to systems engineering, they're right. Because the way they define systems engineering, good. Eric Garner is busy doing a research on the return on investment for systems engineering. He's doing a PhD on this at the University of South Australia. And as long as, you can't argue with it, because systems engineering is what he says it is, and so it overlaps. There are endless pronouncement of positions. You have a debate on systems engineering, people will tell you, my view of systems engineering is X, and they refuse to listen to anything else. So it's not a debate, it's just people just standing there and saying. The information in the textbook is confusing. There are gaps in it. There are no standards on systems engineering. You've heard of MIL 49, 499, 632, or whatever. They're not standards on systems engineering. There's a dichotomy on systems of systems and complex systems. There are two schools of practice. One school of practice says, this is a tremendous problem, we've got to go away and study it, develop, get grants, do some more research. The other group says, what's the problem, and just goes ahead and does it. In general, systems engineering is poorly practiced. Look at the GAO reports in the US. There are defects in the paradigm I pointed out in the past. For 50 years, we have promised big things. You read the textbook of the 50s and the 60s, and systems engineering will solve the complex problem facing us today. You read the textbooks of the 21st century, and they're saying the same thing. We haven't delivered. So you get these mixed reports of successes and failures. And so I'm looking at this, and I'm doing a pattern match, and I said, have you ever seen something like this before? And I look back into American history, and I read about snake oil salesmen. They will sell you sugar water, or they will sell you a solution that will fix your problem. So I give you a new definition for SOS. I said that systems, and there are no standards in systems engineering. You look at 499, it's for systems engineering management. By the time they got to 499A, they dropped the systems. 632 is processes, 1220 is management and process. There aren't any standards that apply to systems engineering. If you want to look at the focus of those standards and you draw them up in the time, you see that the early 499C and 499A are the same in this respect. There are no standards that cover the early phases of systems engineering. The mission purpose definition was left out of the earlier ones, but it was added later. But this whole part of systems engineering, conceptualizing the problem and the options of solution, is in none of the standards. And when I realized this, I sort of wondered why, and I went back and traced the history of systems engineering. And one of the things that came out of my research is I just looked at the number of pages in the documents of each standard as they were produced over time. And can you see how the number of pages go up over time? Does this remind you of anything? Anybody seen the curves that tell you about the cost to fix a defect the later in the program you find it? Same shape curve. And I sort of read 5002R a little more carefully, and I find out that that whole front end is not in systems engineering anymore. It's called CAIV, cost as an independent variable. And the back end part of it is called engineering of systems. But if you look at what CAIV is, it's all that early stage systems engineering activities, the problem solving, which is in none of the standards. So, the question I have to all the people here and to the panelists is, where's systems engineering? This is cost as an independent variable. This is the engineering of systems. Nobody's doing systems engineering, at least in the US DoD. And this is where the costs associated with the systems are. That's where the seeds of the costs are set. And yet, nobody is sort of doing anything about that. So, the structure of the academic forum is 2 afternoons. And the reason is it's to give you thinking time between the first session and the second session. No, it's not. It's to force you to register for at least 2 days. Don't believe me? There are 3 parts per afternoon. So Monday is this opening session, and then session 1 and 2. And on Wednesday, sessions 3 and 4 to close out. As I said, it's panels and questions, discussion, debate. It's dialogue, not presentations. And if any of the presenters don't keep to the rules of engagement, I will give them the finger. You don't think I won't? I have been known to stop a speaker in mid-sentence when his time ran out. So, our first session speakers are as follows. I think Eric may be in the fourth session, sorry about that. And these are the questions, the 7 questions that are going to be addressed in this set. Then after the tea break, Rashmi will be moderating the next 4 questions. On Wednesday afternoon, we will have a team from NPS discussing these questions. And I'm told there are going to be fireworks there because there are very differences of opinions. And at the Wednesday afternoon, Robert will be back with Eric, and they will be addressing these questions. So, Robert, these are the questions for Wednesday afternoon, not for today.
Oh, no, I prepared Wednesday.
Oh.
Well, that's not
So, in session 5, when we close out, the moderators of the sessions will provide information to summarize what went on in each of the previous 4 sessions, and then we'll see what we can do about it. Because we really need to do something about it, or systems engineering will disappear. So, panel and panelists. You state which questions you're addressing. You get to speak for less than 10 minutes, and I'm going to enforce a time limit. And then there's a general discussion by delegates. Now, if a panelist wishes to engage you in dialogue during the course of what he's going to say, then I'll extend the 10 minutes a little more. I'll also be flexible. If you are interested in what the panelist is saying and he runs out of his 10 minutes, if you want him to continue, I'm not going to stop him if the dialogue is going thick and fast. The moderators of each of the panels each of the sessions chooses the format, and you've heard mine, and the moderator's decision are binding. Now, when you make comments on something that somebody says, you focus on the content, not on the person. No personal attacks, please. This is not email, no flags. And at the end of each part, the moderator will sum up and provide the PowerPoints to me, and at the end of the academic forum, we'll repeat the summaries. So I'm going to turn it over now to session 1, fundamental issues, and I'm going to start with Robert.
do this over here, I think. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robert Halligan, Managing Director of Project Performance International, which is a consulting and training company in systems engineering. I've delivered, I guess, haven't actually worked out precisely, but probably 500 in-person hours of systems engineering training over the last 18 or so years, and done that on 6 continents. So,
If I didn't see you, I'll let that.
Oh, sorry about that. I didn't look back. Go back. Okay. Okay. So, let's just go up there. Okay, cool. I'm going to address 4 of the questions. Why can't systems engineers agree on a definition of systems engineering? Why can't systems engineers agree on the role of the systems engineer in an organisation? What skills and knowledge are not being taught? Or not, and it may be a question of not being taught, it may be a question of not being learned. And how can they be? And then certainly what lessons can be learned from teaching systems engineering. I have 3 presentations. 2 of the presentations, the first 2, I'm simply going to run as a backdrop to making remarks. So I don't intend to speak for the presentations, but just let them run in the background, and you may absorb some of the points rather than laboriously going through piles and piles of principles or for that matter, knowledge, skills and attitudes to perform particular aspects of systems engineering. So that's what those 2 first presentations will involve. Seldom crisis. I found Joe's remarks very interesting on the subject, and whilst not disagreeing with him, I really have to point out that as somebody really close to the coalface in engineering education in industry and in engineering practice in industry and in engineering process improvement in industry, I see absolutely no evidence of that occurring at the moment. In fact, I see quite the contrary. I see an accelerating take-up of systems engineering practices, especially in commercial industry, as contrasted with defence industry, where I may make some observations about efficiency and appropriateness of practices, and especially amongst the companies that are already good, and amongst that are the best, or they're aspiring to be the best, and are embracing systems engineering practices as a means of getting into better. I also see consistent executive feedback from companies and middle-level management feedback from companies and on-the-ground engineer feedback from companies that practices commonly associated with systems engineering that are more widely embraced have in fact made significant differences. And it's not a daily event, it's at least a weekly event where I receive that sort of feedback. So, a somewhat different point of view of where we're at the moment with systems engineering without, Joe may be absolutely right, and there's another issue that we'll come to related to that in a moment. Personally, I would have no problem whatsoever if the term systems engineering disappeared, just faded away into oblivion. But I would be really, really upset if good practice in the engineering systems faded away. That would set mankind back considerably. Now, when I teach systems engineering, I introduce a set of principles, somewhere between 14 and 22, depending on the circumstances. I then, for the students, go through, or invite them, I should say, I invite them to consider these principles and draw conclusions on their validity. Now, invariably, with some qualifications which are intended, and we're going to achieve that, they validate the set of principles. I then ask them to consider how these principles have application to the engineering of software. And without exception, the conclusion has been, and this is over scores of deliveries, without exception, the conclusion has been, these principles apply similarly. Well, wrong word, identically. That is, they black and white, they apply, as opposed to non-apply. I then ask another probing question, and that is, to what extent do these principles apply in the engineering of non-systems? Now, of course, everybody said, what's a non-system? And if we're not going to spend time defining what we mean by a system here, but suffice to say, I produce an example, this colleague I have in my pocket. It's a chunk as thin as being engineered. We're not going to go into discussing whether or not it's a system, but it doesn't fit in the conventional definition that I'm aware of a system. And the conclusion is, generally with one qualified exception, that the principles seem to similarly apply.
Robert, do you have an example of the principles that you have shown?
I do. In fact, let me now get this going, and you'll see what I'm talking about as I take the subject further. Let's see.
4 minutes.
What's the code again?
The screen on.
Yeah, I use it. Yeah, okay, thanks, Joe. See on the Mac use fantastic. But there are principles like understanding the problem before we actually physically build the solution, subject to evolution, iterative development, and so on, spiral and so on. But anyway, the principles are now going to, we're just going to scroll through the principles. Now, if these are reasonable conclusions, then we have to conclude, and they are consistent conclusions. So if they are valid and reasonable conclusions, we have to conclude that this systems engineering stuff is much more about engineering in general, and it's not something special, it's not something different, it is simply about doing good engineering. And it has application when people do engineering. Now, of course, the more complex something is, the more important it is, the more novel the technologies are, the more that is at stake, the more important it is to apply sound principles and implement those sound principles with sound methods. But black and white, here's something different. I don't find it surprising at all that people find it difficult to define what is a systems engineer. In fact, well, there's nothing wrong with the term. I occasionally use the term myself, but very rarely. I probably use the term systems engineering 50 times a day. But systems engineer, not that often. From my point of view, there are probably 20 million people in the world who do systems engineering, some of them well, some of them not so well. And there are probably 20,000 who associate themselves with systems engineering. So, now, just keep an eye on making sure we're focusing on subjects here. When that then comes down to role of a systems engineer, again, it follows that there's going to be difficulty in defining what the role of a systems engineer is. If systems engineering is in fact a set of principles supported by methods of engineering things. Because it's not something separate, it's not a discipline, it's a skill set, an knowledge set, and supported by a set of attitudes, which will bring me to the next presentation in a few moments, all to do with engineering things in general, and in that systems are more complex than non-systems, of course, more important than engineering systems. Now, let's just do away from off.
Well, Robert, when it ends, I'm going to have to ask you to relinquish the floor to the next person because you've had your 10 minutes.
How do you?
You've had your 10
10
minutes.
10 minutes, my goodness. Okay. You'll find, some of you received a handout, some of you received a handout, sorry, not a handout, by email, the second presentation. If anybody would like to receive that, just give me a shout, and it's a list of the knowledge, skills and attitudes that may be associated with individual engineering processes. And the third presentation here on offer, this is about to finish, is experience in teaching systems engineering and a number of conclusions about what is not understood. A lot of major things not being understood or practiced by graduate engineers, and many of them also difficult to do more experienced engineers. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Robert. And after the panelists after our speakers here have had a go, then you can ask Robert for more information if you care to. Okay. Eric.
It sounded like Robert was amplified. Is there a microphone here, or can you all hear me fine?
Yeah.
I have to extend an apology for coming in late. Somehow the time over lunch just got away from me, and I suddenly looked down and it was already into the time there. I'm not seeing the icon that says make this thing go. There it is. Okay. Here's a question for you. Question number one in this academic forum: why can't systems engineers agree on a definition of systems engineering? So here is a quiz question for you. Which three of these are definitions of systems engineering? Now, incidentally, if you have certified as a CSEP, you will recognize this question because it's something essentially like this is on the exam, for the CSEP exam. And it says, which three of these are valid definitions? Is it a discipline that concentrates on the design and application of the whole as distinct from the parts? Or is it a development methodology that defines requirements as a way to control things? Or is it an iterative process of top-down synthesis, development, and so on? Or Is it a management philosophy that uses system thinking, or is it an interdisciplinary approach and means to enable the realization of successful systems? Which is the answer? Well, wait a second. The question is asking for 3 answers. And as a matter of fact, if you want the answers on these, here are the 3 answers on this. So you now have one of your 120 questions to pass the CSAT. All right? There's the 3 answers on it right there. But wait a second. Think about the philosophy behind this question itself. Why are there 3 answers? And for that matter, the other 2 answers, I could buy into either of those other 2 answers as well. The only thing that makes those 3 answers correct is that those are the 3 that are cited in the Systems Engineering Handbook. And this says something about our discipline. It says something about the way we view the thing that we do. Here's another aspect of this. Looking across the history of INCOSE, all the way back to 1991 when it started, one of the very first efforts in INCOSE was the Pragmatic Principles paper that was put together with about 25 people who gathered in a room and said, what do we know about systems engineering? And they wrote it down. Okay, a few years later, 1994, the San Francisco area chapter put together the very first version of the Systems Engineering Handbook. And what they were essentially doing was trying to describe the things that we know. In that same time frame, the U.S. Department of Defense canceled Mill Standard 499, and so INCOSE gathered together with other organizations to create a standard for systems engineering and to write down the things that we think we know about systems engineering. Incidentally, that effort fragmented and ended up writing not 1 standard, but 2 standards as the group fractured apart and generated both EIA 632 and IEEE 1220. And look at this history of things. The 15288 standard was again trying to specify what we know. In 2002, Dennis Beattie put together a group to document the systems engineering body of knowledge, trying to describe what we know about systems engineering. Repeatedly through the years, we have tried to document for the world what we know about systems engineering and tell the world what we know so that they will do it. And so the assumption in all of these thoughts is what we know about systems engineering is correct. But the answer I get from all of this is it's very self-evident we can't agree on it. Because every one of these efforts generated that knowledge and documented that knowledge, and then somebody else came along a couple years later and said, we need to write down what we know about systems engineering. What was already written wasn't sufficient. We can't agree on this stuff. Each of us seems to know different things about it. And the question I have in the academic forum is, when are we going to test what we know about systems engineering? When are we going to prove the truth of the things that we think we know? Rather than simply saying, this is what's true.
Yeah, you make this.
Oh, later on. Oh, now let me finish this. What's that?
You make an assumption that there is only one truth.
Well, that's true.
Let Eric finish.
Let me finish, and then we'll handle discussion later. I am being a little bit controversial here. Just a little bit controversial. I'm doing it on purpose. Yeah, provocative. And I'm doing it on purpose because that's what a panel is about. We want to generate this discussion and start talking about these things. I agree with what you're saying. It is true that one of the problems we have is that we have disparate knowledge, and I think that's the point we get to in a couple of slides. I put together this presentation a couple of years ago, and I've used it widely, and lots of people have picked up on it. I looked at all the different standards, and I looked at the language that is not in common across all the different standards. Some of them call it solution definition, or system synthesis, or architecting, or select the solutions, or requirements allocation. It gets called different names in the different standards, and yet we're talking about essentially the same activity. Why have we reached this point? And it's exactly what you're talking about. The issue is systems engineering is more than just these simple processes we try to write down. I love this graphic from NASA. What they say here is that systems engineering has several different dimensions, that the actual capability to do this stuff is more than just processes. That's what's wrong with CMMI. CMMI is a great tool, and you can measure your processes, but all you're measuring is the processes. And the actual capability to do systems engineering requires how you do the processes. What are the tools and methods that you use to do them? And even more than that, it requires the skills and capabilities of the people. And those skills and capabilities are the kinds of things that Bodhi Frank has been studying in terms of the cognitive characteristics of how people work and what are systems engineers and what they do. Incidentally, I just met another fellow, Duarte, didn't catch his last name. Oh, he's right here. I'm sorry, yes. We were just speaking at lunch about exactly the same issue. Of what are the characteristics of these people we call systems engineers. And without the right characteristics, you can give them all the processes you want, and what they do isn't very effective. And so we have to somehow deal with these issues that go beyond the processes, that go beyond the technical stuff. Systems engineers today grow through a process. We've seen the dimensions, the levels of systems engineering. This is another way of thinking about that. In the Middle Ages in Europe, there was this process of guilds, that people learned their trade through the guilds. They started out as an apprentice, and then they became a journeyman. And the journeyman knew how to do the job, but they'd travel around and they'd run across other masters, and they would learn from the other masters until they decided that they had enough knowledge, and then they would create their masterpiece and submit it to the guild for approval. And then they'd be labeled a master. And they'd be able to settle down someplace and practice the trade and take on apprentices. I've got 2 slides left. We're almost done. And that's what's going on in systems engineering today. That's how we grow our systems engineers. They grow by getting this knowledge from other people rather than having any sort of a theoretical underpinning that makes it work. And that's what we're lacking in what we have today. A growth of a systems engineer today starts with a basic education in some engineering discipline, gain some level of experience, and then they go back for systems engineering education, and then they gain some systems engineering experience. And so systems engineer number 1 goes through his career, and in his career he touches different domains, gets different knowledge, gains the breadth, becomes a systems engineer, has this knowledge that is hard-won, because they had this knowledge through very hard projects, and they succeeded or failed, they learned things along the way. Systems engineer number 2 went through a different domain, and she was working in different kinds of things. And she got her knowledge through different capabilities, and she ends up with different knowledge than systems engineer number 1 did. Systems engineer number 3 works in a completely different domain. They're working in the commercial world, and they're creating product systems that are very different than the defense systems that the first 2 were. And so systems engineer number 3 has a completely different world. And as you can see, what this generates is the fact that every one of us has our own hard-won knowledge base. And that's why we have all of this conflict in what we do. And it comes down to the fact that, once again, we have to prove the things we think we know, instead of just relying on the heuristic knowledge, the experiential knowledge that each one of us has from our career. And that goes against the grain of who we are.
Thank you,
the reason
Eric.
we are systems engineers is because we are...
Thank you, Eric.
So, thank you.
Okay, our next speaker, Chandra.
I don't have it.
You might as well stay there.
Oh, okay. Slide. Right. I can stand. Okay, I'll also talk about actually 3 things, but I don't think I have the time, so I'll just talk about 2 things. Why can't systems engineers agree on the definition of systems engineering? And the second thing was, why can't they agree on the role of the system engineer? I mean, that's that, right? Yeah. Okay. System engineering, from my point of view, depends on the business or the end products you're going into. Working in these 3 directions, as I said, you work in an industrial product, you're developing a product for the commercial market, or you work in an R&D, the area where you're doing system engineering to develop a concept of operation and have technology transfer and send it out. The third thing is, you're working in a service-oriented organization where you use the system engineering skills to help the organization you're working with to develop something, whether it be a product or a service, and that's used by that service organization. Having worked in all these three things, I found one thing in common, that if you do not take ownership of what you are doing and take responsibility for what your part of the job is, you are not going to get a good product. Case in point, if I'm working for a company that's making a product for sale, and I'm doing hardware engineering on it, right? I have got to make sure that I'm not going to do my system, my analysis of the problem, or my conceptualization of how I'm going to use this hardware product in a vacuum. I have to talk to the other people working on the product. Now, I'm a hardware engineer, so I'm not a system engineer, right? If I'm a system engineer and I'm trying to make sure that this product works, I want to make sure that the hardware engineer and the software engineer and the test engineer and everybody works together and takes responsibility and ownership for their part in making this product a viable product to the set of requirements. Case in point, now the company I worked for that was building an oscilloscope. I'm not mentioning their name, and they had chip designers on it, they had testers on it, they had conceptualizers, people who did the concept on it and all that. And it was supposed to be released on a certain date, a certain year. In fact, the name of the product had the year marked on it. However, just before they released it, they found out that it was not performing as well as they thought it was going to perform. Guess what? They didn't release it. Even though the product said the product name was the date it was going to be released on, like say 1986 or something, the date. But they released it 1 year late. Because they released it 1 year late, the competitor had a different product that they brought out in time that had the same type of concept they were using. And they lost some of the market share. However, they still came out on top, saying that they produced quality goods. Now they took ownership, they took the responsibility. I find that today, when you work in a system engineering organization with service-oriented products, you're giving system engineers to work on something. The system engineer says, I'm only going to look at the processes you're going to use. You're going to use this process, you're going to use this process. And the system architect does the system architecting. And the system test engineer does the test engineer. Case in point, he says, well, that's not my job, that's the system architect's job. He's going to look at how the architecture is going to work with the rest of the software and the hardware is going to work. And then he said, well, the testing has to be done. Oh, that's the test engineer's job. I know. At the end of, say, 6 months or 1 year, when they're going to do a prototype testing, they find that, well, the test engineering work was not done well enough because there was no interaction between them. There is no ownership, there is no responsibility between the two of them. So, we've got to define what is system engineering. The system engineer, in my opinion, is a person who knows all aspects of engineering needed to make the product work. That doesn't mean to say that the system engineer should be a hardware designer, software designer, but he or she should know what needs to be done to make his or her part work correctly and have to take responsibility to make sure that it works correctly. You can't turn around and say, and pass the buck to someone else, hey, I didn't know it, that's his fault, that's his problem. And I see it happening all the time. Having worked in all these three fields, I see it happening all the time. The second thing is, so that was the case of why can't they agree on the role of the engineer. Based on this, so we see all these problems operate. We see that, okay, this system had a problem, this had a cost overrun. We are learning lessons, but these lessons are not being taught to us. Case in point, I went for a system engineering conference where we had all the defense departments coming in, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy from the US. And the role there was reliability and supportability. They showed it's common knowledge, so I can talk about it. They showed a slide where they said that only 43% of all systems that have been developed by the defenses have met the reliability, the professed reliability numbers. That, let me tell you, is not only the US, it's worldwide. It's less than 50% of the products have met the reliability number. And people say, well, no, they have met it. No, they have not met the number that they said they were going to get. They have made changes. And the reason is, they have a problem. They have lessons learned, but they don't teach the lessons. They don't tell people, this happened because test engineering didn't do this, or the concurrent engineering didn't do this, or the specialty engineering didn't do this. They did not teach those lessons. And that to me is something that, when I worked on a project, the first system engineering project I worked, not with Joe, the project after Joe, the one thing that was not told to me was, look, we did this thing before, and these are the things pitfalls you got to look for. That was never told to me. And I think that's very important. When I work on a project with somebody else, and I tell the guy working for me, I say, listen, we had this project before, and these are the things that you've got to look for. These are the weakest links. In any reliability, the weakest link. Look at this project, make sure that this part is done correctly. This has not been taught. So, we take lessons learned, we take CMMI 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we say, oh, we have this level, we record our processes, the process does this, the process does that. But we do not teach these things to people. How do you take that lessons learned, convert it into information that you can give people and say, look, this was the weakest link. So hereafter, if you're writing a program, you're doing object-oriented design, do not work in a vacuum. Do your interfaces first. Make sure your interfaces work. Make sure that this person knows exactly how you're going to talk, which bus you're using. It can be hardware, it can be software. Which product you're running on, the platform, the server or the blade, doesn't matter. If you're using an FPGA or an ASIC, it really doesn't matter. Just make sure that you know you're talking to each other. Because we had this problem before. We had this product, this great, fantastic concept, system engineering was done very well. The biggest problem we had, interfaces didn't work. Okay, we had cost overruns, we went on for 6 months. Teach that to the next person coming in. Listen, you're running a complex system as it's called. Complex meaning you're having a lot of commercial off-the-shelf pieces of software running with commercial off-the-shelf software, commercial off-the-shelf hardware running commercial off-the-shelf hardware. What's the biggest problem you're going to have? How they talk to each other. The glue logic, the glue software, the glue hardware. Teach them to the people.
2 minutes.
So, how do we teach this to the people? How do we teach this to the students coming out? Right? As Eric said, basic engineering education. The tier project, the tiers that Joe spoke about today, the 5 tiers. What it is, how you do it, how well you do it, and how you do it, and conceptualize it, and innovate. And then you start innovating. This comes with experience, right? But it also comes with basic common knowledge. If I am going to talk to somebody else, if I do not talk the same language, that person is not going to understand me. When I first time I wrote a paper, first time I wrote a document, my supervisor told me, you're very verbose. Get to the point, right? Remove the extraneous stuff. Like say A plus A is equal to 2A, B plus B is equal to 2B. So I did that. Then I was told, well, into a graph, give a little more information. So I learned. So, and I happen to be verbose, but I talk fast, so I can say a lot more in a short period of time. That's fine.
We hadn't really noticed.
So the question was, what is all the communication is very important. So if you can tell that in very basic terms, new engineers coming up, communication is important, and communication is interface, and interface is the most important part in a complex system design. You're one half the battle. The second part, you tell the person, the test engineer and specialty engineer and the software engineer, look, you want to talk to each other. You're going to write the program, he's going to test the program. You're going to make how well it performs. You've got how you're going to test it, so you're going to make sure you're writing the program the way it can be tested. The minute you start writing those things, the interfaces are most important. One, you got it.
Thank you very much.
I have never actually heard anybody take so many words to say lessons learned are right only memories.
Okay, start with the question and keep it brief, Joe said. So I've fulfilled one of his 2 requirements, which I think on average is pretty good. So, reference curriculum, I'm going to talk about does it add value and how does it help us get professional systems engineers, whatever that means. I've questioned up a little bit, what should we put in a reference curriculum, how would we use it, what value might it give. So I'm going to give a little bit of background to that and then we can maybe ask those questions later on. I've been involved for the last couple of years, along with a number of other people, some of whom are in this room, in some work we started at Stevens Institute, sponsored by the DoD Systems and Software Directorate. And really it came from a question, where are the systems engineering and software engineering professionals? In a way, it goes back to what Joe was saying. I think we've done a pretty good job of selling people to the idea that they need to do systems engineering, and they're not arguing with us about that anymore. Now they're saying, where are the systems engineers? Let's start doing it. And, well, we haven't got any of those yet. We just wanted to tell you the idea. So that's where the question came from. There are lots of ways of answering that question, but professional master's education was seen to be one of them. If graduate education is where you learn the science and the underlying principles of things, postgraduate education, particularly professional masters, what I mean by that is if someone doesn't know, is where you learn how to do it in the real world for your chosen field. Or it's the educational part of where you learn that. So that was the bit that we were specifically tackling. Systems engineering and software engineering are put together in this because I guess there's a suggestion that they are closely related to each other. You can't separate them, and that they have similar principles, as Robert was saying, and we can develop them together. This project was looking to do three things. It was looking to, first of all, produce a reference curriculum for software engineering that had a good chunk of systems engineering in it. We've been doing that, and I'll briefly mention what we've been doing in a moment. And then to do the same thing the other way around, to produce a curriculum for systems engineering with an appropriate amount of software engineering, and then, because you have to have a stretch target, maybe to do a truly cross-discipline curriculum that covers both. In your bags for this conference, you've got a flyer for something called Guesswork. That's how you pronounce it. That's quite clever. It wears a bit thin after a while, but it's quite clever. There's a website, and we've got to the point where we've produced the first version of the software engineering reference curriculum, or we will have done by the end of the summer, and we'd like to start having people use it, adopt it, look at it, and broaden it out. And we hope to be starting on the second part, the software systems engineering curriculum later. A group of people, this is another example, sorry Eric, this is another example of people sitting in a room working out what we know to a certain extent, but it was a good group of people and they did know a lot. I've pulled out 4 of the names and highlighted them, not because they were particularly big contributors, but because they're the main people representing INCOSE as part of this group, and Art and Ricardo over here is Barry. So we've been involved in doing this along with a whole lot of other systems engineering educators. At the beginning, there were a number of principles set out. I'm not going to read those. I have these slides afterwards. But professional masters, by which we mean a master's degree which is specifically aimed at giving value to people as part of their employment. So not the kind of master's you do in a subject because you're going to go on to do a PhD and become an academic in the subject. It's something you do for a couple of years part-time, directly relevant to your job, that kind of master's course. But it was going to be about fundamental skills of knowledge, but it was going to include guidance and practical advice for academics on how to create these programs, that it was going to be flexible and allow domain-specific and elective material, and that it was going to try and look at new technologies, new development practices, new ways of educational delivery, and be modern and up-to-date, and that it would be internationally applicable. So all those things. I cheated a little bit and put all my slides on one page. If you get this presentation, the slides are in there to read separately. I'm not going to go through all the words on here. We wanted to look at the characteristics of a software or systems engineer, not just what they know, but what use are they. So we looked at the expectations and the outcomes of somebody doing this kind of course. It's a professional master's, and this is what causes the most argument, but we wanted some real-world experience. That either means you come into the master's with experience, or you gain experience during it. As Chandra was just saying, they need to have, in some way, seen why it doesn't work. And they need to see some case studies and examples, and they need to understand how they work together with people to solve this. They've got simply about teaching you theory. So either before or during becoming a Master of Software Systems Engineering, you need to have that real-world experience part of it. And then 4 sets of outcomes. What makes a professional, in this case software engineer, what makes a professional systems engineer? And I can summarize those as a mastery of the core skills. So the knowledge is important. They need to know what they need to know. But also have specialist skills. So all systems engineers need to know a broad spectrum of things, and then they will specialise in architecting or requirements, testing validation. As we were just saying, you can't specialise without also knowing what all the other people are doing. And there has to be some domain skills. You have to teach them something about avionics or space or oil or something alongside their systems or their software skills to make this work. So that's important. And we try to work out what mastery means, what do they need to know. That also that they would be able to apply those skills as part of a team to solve problems. So as an outcome of this educational process, not only do you have people who understand the skills and knowledge, but who've got some experience and have been explained to them what it means to work in a team with other people to solve real-world problems. Because if you can't do that, you've just got book learning, and you might as well just read the book. So that's an important outcome. How we achieve it is our job, I guess. But if you can't do that, you haven't brought people up to a professional level of software or systems engineering. And that they would be given the skills to continually keep themselves up to date and improve their core knowledge and their team working throughout the rest of their careers. If you don't teach them how to find out what's going on and keep up to date, you've only given them a snapshot and they won't be any use for the rest of their careers. So that's somehow part of the educational experience. How did we try and do that? Well, we looked at body of knowledge. Body of knowledge is obviously important, but only one part of professionalising the discipline and producing professional practitioners of the discipline. We put a body of knowledge together for software engineering. Part of the reason we did software engineering first is because there is a reasonably well-recognised body of knowledge. So what software engineering body of knowledge exists, and we leveraged very much on that. We did add things to it. We added some stuff on ethics, we beefed up the stuff on project management decision making, and critically we put in a section on systems engineering. And all the way through this document, it makes a very strong case for the relationship between software engineering and systems engineering, and software engineering and engineering. I think that's something we've heard several times this afternoon. We put an architecture together to try and help people create master's courses based on this curriculum.
2 minutes.
And the architecture says you've got to cover the core aspects of the body of knowledge. And to work out what the core was, we looked at Bloom's taxonomy, and we looked at, across the body of knowledge, how much of it should you be aware of, all of it, how much of it should you be able to do as part of a team, or lead, or be specialist in. So there's a core body of knowledge as well as the thing. We've recognised the fact that a master's programme will also need to have its own specialist subjects, its elective subjects, and that will change from course to course, or master programme to programme, sorry. We call them courses in the UK. But that you could do that within this framework and still be following the reference curriculum, and that there had to be some capstone experience as part of the education to make sure that people spent at least some time in teams solving real problems. We put something in there to allow people to compare their programs to the framework so we could get some cross-relationship. This is really the last thing I want to say is in terms of what we've tried to put together here. We started off with a big document and we wrote down lots of stuff. What we tried to do towards the end is to produce 3 things. So there's the core curriculum bit, which is the body of knowledge, the architecture, the outcomes, the standard bit, if you like, and that's been written as a separate document. We're currently working with a number of professional bodies, the ACM, IEEE, Computer Society, and COSE, to take stewardship of this and to take it forward as part of the professionalisation bit. An implementation guide where we wrote down what the people in the room knew about how to put a good programme together, so we can pass that on to people, because we think that's just as important. And the third thing, which we haven't really done very much about, but I think is quite exciting, is to produce some kind of forum to start to get a community together where people can share their experiences of using this to do this, some kind of website, something interactive, where we can build a community of people putting programs together in this subject and try and make that work. That's really what we've done. I'll come back to the questions. There's one more slide which gives my brief ideas on what the answers to those questions are, but I'm not going to show you that because...
That's good, because you're out of time.
See that in her presentation afterwards. Thank you very much.
And our next presenter, discussant, is Tim Ferriss. If you can't find it, we'll skip it.
I still know what my name is, I just had to see it. Okay, so I'm speaking on the subject. I will address something about all of the questions. Now, there's no agreed definition. Some people get rather sad about that. Many definitions exist, and each conveys a useful part of the whole. And I think it a lot reflects where that person sits within the community that's interested in systems engineering. And even if we did come up with a formal definition, everybody would use it to mean whatever they want it to mean. There's no agreed role of the systems engineer. Now, is that really a problem either? Different organisations set out to do different kinds of work, and therefore they have to employ staff who are able to do the kind of work they do and classify the staff in a way which is meaningful inside their own organisation. Is it necessary to have some sort of object-oriented view of sets of roles and responsibilities so that you have a particular role which is called the systems engineer, which exactly fits in every organisation? Somewhere you have some glue-type people who don't quite fit anywhere, and they'd only be employable in one place, because they'd be the ones who fill up all the gaps which the different places need. So there's a contextual thing here about the nature of the role that fits. Now, is there a gap in the teaching? I believe that systems engineering is fundamentally a profession which is practiced. It's not primarily something which we know about. It's something we do. And therefore, a complete systems engineering education means an integration of knowledge about the subject matter. That's something education institutions have a tradition of addressing. Knowledge of the generic tools and processes, the means of doing the work, and that can be learned in the classroom or in the workplace or in some combination of the two. And there's the development of the appropriate affect and skills to practice. And to a fair extent, that can only be learnt in the workplace under the pressure of real work, delivering real products when you're responsible for what happens. Employers don't like hearing that. I think, and then there's a question of the hard concepts to teach. My experience is that the hardest concept to teach at the undergraduate level, or with employer-forced students, those who are sponsored by their employers and they're there and say, I wonder why I'm here, is the idea of viewing the engineering situation as related to a whole system, a whole thing which has to be a coherent whole and be delivered, as opposed to their favourite technology, which is one dimension of that system. When I teach postgraduate students who have chosen to study systems engineering, they've already got over that hurdle. And so then there are a number of other subject areas which each student will find challenges with particular subject areas. But probably none of them really stand out as a particularly difficult area, although the ones that stretch them out of the traditional technology focus of most engineering undergraduate training are the more challenging ones. So I think the hard things to teach are not concepts, but rather these sorts of things. How to design the product system, how to develop suitable architectures, how to predict the behaviour, how to get a balanced solution, those sorts of things. And they're capabilities that relate to practice. And it brings me to the idea that systems engineering education is about personal transformation of the student. They change the kind of person they are as a result of the education. They don't just change a bunch of knowledge inside their head. Engineering concerns designing new product systems, and most engineering education concerns analysis, a fundamentally different activity. And to some extent, when you teach somebody analysis, you hurt their ability to design and synthesize. Because the thought patterns associated with one can be contradicted by the thought patterns which are required for the other. And so one can inhibit the other. And engineering performs the necessary to achieve the desired. Science is about getting everything beautifully described. Now, reference curriculum. I've mentioned a whole lot of things to do with context before. The person's work role is related to context. The knowledge they need is related to context. A reference curriculum, I think, as Rick was saying, is good if it gives a guidance to people who are designing an overall curriculum for a program. But it shouldn't be ever set up so that it is prescriptive. It should be guidance. And in fact, in accrediting a program, there should be a matter of looking at the abilities which are created in the graduate, an outcomes-oriented view rather than an input-oriented view, and a need to ensure that the outcomes which are achieved in a particular program are appropriate for the destination of the majority of graduates of that particular institution. So depending on what the location and purpose of the institution is, what the particular balance of outcome skills should be. And I think I've really talked about that. And now let's come on to the relationship of INCOSE and academics. This relationship, I think, has two major aspects. There's an education aspect and there's a research aspect. I think INCOSE can provide a good venue for discussion, debate and all the rest of it about curriculum. What work in a number of ways. And also, it would be useful to develop systems engineering related research method or methods which are applicable to the kind of interests of our field. Just as many other fields have developed research methods which suit the interests of their fields, we need to consider what are the appropriate research methods in our area. And then develop publications which legitimate the doing of research which is actually useful for people in the practice of systems engineering, rather than legitimating research which is somehow abstracted from what is really useful in industry. Now, something I've observed is that INCOSE is a distinctive professional organisation
You've got 1 minute.
amongst various professional organisations. At our conferences, we get a lot of people from industry and government, the practitioner community, and academics coming together. We don't have conferences which are almost solely academics coming together to present papers to each other and to go away. This is a special opportunity for those communities to get together and create perspectives in the academic community of what is the useful research to do, what kind of findings would actually be helpful. And that can be used to orient the research projects, the topics which are investigated, and the manner of investigation, and the kind of results which are obtained and reported, so that they become useful in the community for doing our work.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
This is the point where I throw it open to you to either ask questions or to make comments. I told you the moderator's rule applies to this session. Rick gave me a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper, Ricardo gave me a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper was a paragraph, and on the basis of what was written on the paragraph, Ricardo is not speaking. No, he wasn't bad, he just said that Rick was covering it, and there was no reason for him to speak.
But I'd like to use my 10 minutes in discussion, not
But Rick will Rick's field is the reference curriculum, and he will address any questions that pertain to that. So I now turn it over to you to ask questions, and I have one over here. Questions or comments?
I've never found self-flagellation to be a particularly useful exercise. And I think it's time for systems engineers to stop self-flagellating about the definition of systems engineering. We have enough definitions that I think cover the essentials of what systems engineers do. I appreciate Eric's presentation of the different systems engineers working in different domains. That's one of the reasons we don't all define it the same way. A systems engineer working for a shoe factory will describe systems engineering very differently from a systems engineer working in a shipyard. I could say the same about mechanical engineers in those two professions as well. So why should we expect that all systems engineers would describe their profession the same? I don't believe that the American Society of Mechanical Engineers or any other professional society spends much time worrying about the definition of their profession. They know what it is, and I think we know what it is. So I'd like to suggest we stop flagellating ourselves with the definition.
Would you please put the question slide?
Molly, could you possibly use the mic?
Yes, I'd like to refer to question number 3. What skills and knowledge are not being taught, and how can they be taught? And there is one major skill that the panel members didn't mention. I think this is a very, very important thing, and I refer to system thinking. How do you teach system thinking? Is it possible to teach system thinking? That's it, the comments.
Okay, gentlemen, who wants to handle that one?
I'll go briefly. I think you can encourage and nurture systems thinking. Get people, like Tim was talking about, people who come and want to do a course generally will be capable of systems thinking. You can teach them how to do it better. When you get people who are sent to you and told they're going to be systems thinkers, that's when you struggle. I don't think you can teach it to everybody. I think if people have the aptitude for it, you can give them techniques and skills and improve it and make them better.
There are initiatives in South Africa, Australia and the United States to teach systems thinking at secondary school level, 13, 15-year-olds. There are enterprises specialising in that, such as the Walters Foundation. That would seem to suggest that it's possible.
Is it innate ability or or a myth?
My own view is that different people have different abilities in a different way, but everybody has some of them. And it is possible to enhance that ability through my perception.
Okay, we have. If you please use the microphone.
Can you see the audio?
I don't understand why teaching systems thinking would be any harder than teaching differential equations or any other type of thinking. If we look at cognitive psychology programs, they teach all types of different types of thinking. I don't see there's anything particular about systems thinking that makes it that you have to want to learn it to be able to learn it any more than that would be the case in chemistry or anywhere else. There's a set of skills and there's a theory underlying it. We can talk about general systems theory and systems science, and you can build that up from there. You can teach them the techniques. Interestingly, one of the things that the question here is why can't we agree on a definition? I agree with this gentleman here that we should stop agonising over it. But how about a rich picture? And we can talk about the different perspectives looking at systems engineering and then describe why they might have a different perspective on their definition and things like that. So I think there's no reason why systems thinking can't be taught to anybody. Anybody who doesn't want to learn something can find a way not to learn anything.
Can I ask that question?
Yeah, please step up, please.
Hi, my name is Dwight Gonsalves. I've been looking at this specific area recently, working with some psychologists in the area of psychometrics. There's a test called the Cognitive Process Profile, which measures cognitive processes. So logical thinking, analytical thinking, integrative thinking, holistic thinking, and other types of thinking which might not be useful for engineering, like impulsive or random thinking. The test measures competence and also preference for. what we've discovered is that, and we've actually profiled engineers in our company, and talking to the psychometrists who are, in some cases, developed these tests over a period of decades, and have extensive experience in this, what we've discovered is that most engineers are either logical or analytical. Okay? According to the psychometrist, analytical thinking is easier to teach than integrative thinking. Integrative thinking is very difficult to teach. If you start early, it's a long-term process. So when we talk about systems thinking, we're drawing on holistic and integrative thinking. These are, in the psychologist's view, cognitive psychologists, the most difficult to develop. So, I think that, and what we found is that there's a very small proportion of people who will have a number of competencies in referring to the INCOSE UK framework, competencies defined there. There are very few people that will actually have a large number of those. We will find lots of engineers with 1 or 2 or 3 of these competencies, but not a large number with competencies, a large number of those competencies in one person. So when you ask the question, well, is systems engineering or systems thinking easy to teach? Well, I would say it's the most difficult thing. Analytical thinking is easy, but that's not the same thing. The other thing that we find is that the preference for these things varies. For some engineers, the preference for integrative thinking is much lower than, for example, analytical thinking. We've also found that we can identify risks. People who are impulsive or random thinkers are probably not the kind of people you want as engineers. So this is also a useful screening method.
Depends what you're doing.
Hold it. Anybody else want to comment?
Please step up. Yeah, please.
Well, camera.
I'm Bo Oppenheim with a huge jet lag, so please forgive me if I'm half coherent. My perspective from LMU, the university in Los Angeles, where we teach that stuff, is that we are forgetting the big elephant in the room in this whole business, and that's the role of the Pentagon, the role of the acquisition system, which I believe governs 90% of practical problems, and it hardly is present in the curricula. And unless and until we start talking about this big, ugly elephant, inefficient, stupid, incompetent, with 20 other, adjectives, pejorative adjectives that you want to add, unless we address that, we will never be able to do systems engineering properly in the defense context. So, just a little bit.
Anybody else? Barry? Are you coming for a question or are you leaving the room?
I guess, the best way that we've found to try to keep people systems thinking is to involve them in team project courses that have real plans, where they've got 24 weeks to build something for this client. They can't accept everything. They've got to find out. They've got to go visit the client's facility and find out how they do business. They've got to negotiate functions and priorities and qualities and things like that with them. And if they don't, they're going to disappoint these clients. And what I find is that when people get together with other people and are forced to either be analytic and come up with something that is not going to be successful, or be open-minded and try to invent options for mutual gain, that they tend to become more system thinking than they were before. So basically, we start with a whole bunch of people that are computer science majors, and we end up with people that at least have glimmerings of what system engineering can do for them.
Yeah, please.
I'm Ariella Sofa from George Mason University, and I'd like to echo two things. First of all, what Tim said is I don't think that we should have a single definition of systems engineering. I think that will be the death of the profession if we try to buttonhole it and narrow it down so that only we do it and someone else who's different is not a systems engineer. So actually, things like that kill the profession. I am also skeptical about the reference curriculum, partly because we have a program, a master's in systems engineering, but no single student who goes through our program actually knows everything that is supposed to be known. I don't think that anyone who goes through any program can know everything. Knowledge, well, that's what your reference curriculum states what a systems engineer graduate, maybe you didn't define it. Maybe it wasn't defined very well, but certainly it's a lifelong learning. Systems engineering is a lifelong learning, and it's an evolving field. It changes even from year to year. So I'm doubtful that you can capture all of that in reference curriculum. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I'd like you to go and have a look at what we've written and then see if that's not exactly what we've done. I, too, am sceptical about the kind of reference curriculum that says these are things you have to learn. And that's not what we tried to do. We really haven't.
You know, if I look at progress or development in information systems, they went through a similar kind of crisis regarding definitions and, you know, that whole issue. One of the things that in the information systems community, as far as I understand it, they went to look at the whole area of epistemology. And epistemology is really concerned with the study of the theories of knowledge. How do we acquire new knowledge? So if I think about this, how many papers do you see out there that describe the methodology which they used to do the research? I think one of the underlying problems here is that because we come from a physics world, many of us, we've inherited inherently in our underlying our thinking is positivism. And so we also inherit a couple of other things. We value at universities decontextualized knowledge more than context-sensitive knowledge. So the problem here is that the university's role is to teach that decontextualized knowledge, but the employer wants context-sensitive knowledge. Now, how do we balance this? In my view, I think some of the answer has been touched on, and that's a practice-based approach. It's not necessarily that we have universities or industry as two separate factions sitting on either side of the fence, but that these two must work together. We must also realize that knowledge, even in physics, mathematics, is socially constructed. It does not exist out there. We have it in our heads. We agree on things. And in social sciences, there are many disputes on theories. They are not accepted. And so if we have definitions, etc., where there are disparate views, this is normal. This is because at the realm that we're working on, we're not at the physics level anymore. There is more than one way to engineer a system successfully. As long as the physics are right and the customer is happy, that's all that matters, isn't it?
I'd like to respond to that. I think that's a very important point, and it's the sort of issue that was underlying my comments about developing an appropriate research methodology within systems engineering. And I have done some further work on that, which was published in the CISA conference a few months ago, related to developing appropriate research methodologies for projects to get the kind of knowledge that you want. So there's all that analysis of what kind of knowledge do you want, and then what is the method that derives that knowledge. And so there's a lot more to do in that area, but it's starting. But another very interesting thing I found, my university librarians were unable to find any book on engineering research methods in print.
And we've got, hold it, would you sit down please? We've got somebody else who's been waiting. Are you waiting for a question?
Yeah. I wasn't going to mention this very much, but the reference curriculum thing is sort of I'm against it, if you will. I'm the program chair at Johns Hopkins System Engineering Program. And I think that if we go towards a reference curriculum, I think it'll perpetuate what is system engineering, what isn't it. People will have programs and they'll have to respond to is it or isn't it? I mean, I understand that we'll end up having to do that, and I think it's more appropriate for a trade school kind of thing, where it's like nursing or something like that. We'll just kind of perpetuate that thing. So I think we want to be taken seriously as an academic discipline where you can call a reference, and we can call it a professional degree, or we can say preparation for doctoral studies. People can go either way. I just think a reference curriculum is too restrictive in that sense.
Okay, Greg?
Greg Crown, West Point. I would like to be curious what the panel's view on the following is. My experience, the worst thing I've seen that hurt system engineering is people who get the job chief system engineer for a major Department of Defense program and have this much experience in system engineering. They could not pass our introductory system engineering course at West Point for undergraduates, and yet they get the title. And they brief leaders in the Department of Defense as the chief system engineer. To me, that is a threat that is dwarfs in magnitude some of the other threats we've talked about, which are competent people coming out of competent graduate programs that may not know everything, but at least they've got some pretty sound fundamentals.
It's worse than that, Greg. I heard the chief systems engineer at DoD give a keynote speech at the dinner at CSER, and I cringed. Okay, we'll start from Robert's end. Eric?
I think this entire issue of, it goes back again to what is the scope of our discipline. Something like that can happen because we don't understand what our discipline is. And so a manager puts somebody in there with that title because nobody can say, well, that's not really a systems engineer.
But does that just mean the manager didn't know what it was?
Well, but the manager, his decision was accepted by lots of other people, or that person wouldn't have been in that position.
Joe, I just want to add to...
Would you step up to the microphone, please?
Yeah. The comment about whether a certain position and a role, whether a chief systems engineer is good enough or competent enough to be a chief systems engineer, again, as all of you have been talking about, it's very contextual. If you ask Accenture or if you ask, IBM or some other kinds of environments where they are doing systems engineering, but maybe not calling it, and they have positions which sound like a system engineer. It may be very true that if they they won't be able to pass our exam. So what? They have their own definition of what they mean by and how they have defined that role. It doesn't mean that they have to pass Stevens exams or John Hopkins or Keio University or anyone. I personally don't think that should be a big point.
The problem is whether they actually get the job done. And then
that's up to the company.
In the kind of case that Greg is describing, they put a manager in that position, and often I've seen this happen, and what happens is the manager suppresses some of the technical work that should have been done because the manager did not understand the whole picture of what needed to be done.
The question here also is that you're talking about a company, an organization where they put somebody in charge and call him a chief system engineer. It boils down to the fact that they have a definition of system engineer. My question is...
And a definition of the role.
Right. No, my answer is the fact that you can say that that person is incompetent, that means based on the fact that that person has done that type of job before and not got the job done. So we are not learning. We are not learning anything from that. We have made one mistake. We are not learning from that mistake. So we don't know what we really need to be done. So if you don't know what has to be done, you can't put a person in that job. So the question is, it boils down to the fact that can that person take ownership for the job he's doing or she is doing? They're not taking the responsibility of the ownership because the person who has put that person in that position is not taking ownership. Because at the end of it all, somebody has to decide. And like you decided that the person was incompetent. How do you decide they're incompetent? Because they didn't get the job done. If they didn't get the job done, that person had been elected out because he was there earlier and people didn't learn from it.
We are about out of time. It is 3 minutes to 3, and the tea break starts at 3 o'clock. So you're welcome to continue this discussion during the break, I would just like to, I'm not really going to summarize, other than I'm going to point out two observations that I noticed here. I haven't seen anything about moving forward and resolving the situation. Chuck made a suggestion that says stop trying to define it and move on with it. And we got some reactions as to why we actually can't really do that. I also saw one instance where we've got people on this, sitting at this table come from industry and academia, and I saw one instance where industry said exactly what needed to be done and academia totally ignored it. And I'd also like to thank the group for helping me understand what went on in electrical engineering before the adoption of Ohm's law. How many people here have an electrical engineering background? And how many people know what Ohm's law is and how intuitive it is? Well, it took 15 years for it to be accepted. And looking around at the state of systems engineering, my hypothesis is it is in the state that electrical engineering was at the time. And unless we get an equivalent of Ohm's law, we are not going to go any further, and systems engineering will disappear. I thank you very much for coming to this session. The academic forum will pick up again in half an hour.
So join in once we start the session. So welcome to this session 2 of the academic forum. The topic is preparing the next generation of systems engineers. I know in different places it has been phrased differently, but the gist of it is basically how well equipped we are right now in terms of our curriculum and pedagogy and other things, and to what extent does the industry and the government and the other institutions feel about how ready are our students to perform the roles of systems engineers as these companies would like them to. So I just wanted to introduce the panelists, and just to start the discussion, I wanted to share with you some of the research that has been done by the National Science Board about the next generation of skill sets that are required by the engineering graduates. So our panelists are Baslin Bunton, Regina, Wiley, Yoshi, and Paul. You all probably know all of them. Let me just give you a little brief on their background. Baslin is Chief System Engineer at Federal Aviation Agency in the US, and she was very instrumental in starting the Stevens program of systems engineering for their FAA employees. We do a lot of teaching for FAA. Regina works with Sandia Labs, and she has several different responsibilities and roles within INCOSE. She's the Deputy Technical Director right now, and she has a PhD from New Mexico University, right, on computer engineering. Regina has been instrumental in many different initiatives taken within the INCOSE and has played many different roles. Wiley, you all know, is very well known in the space domain, and he's leading our space systems engineering program in Stevens, and has been involved in several initiatives around competencies and skill sets of systems engineers. Professor Okami is the Dean of the Graduate School of System Design and Management in Keio University. He has been extremely instrumental in driving the efforts towards establishing a new discipline and a new school in a country where it wasn't systems engineering wasn't really known till a few years ago, and he has gathered a wonderful team of professors and researchers, and all of them are very young, and he has been able to attract them from the industry and many different places. Paul, you all know, was president of INCOSE until last year or 2 years ago, was it? Yeah. while Paul was the president, I got to do participate in several initiatives with the Academic Council in INCOSE, and one of the activities that we did was a study of the systems engineering graduate programs in the US, and we identified 35 programs, analyzed their curriculum, and wrote up a study, a report for INCOSE on what we found. So that's a little bit of a background on their involvement on this topic that we are going to discuss today. So the plan is to focus on these 4 questions. What will the next generation system engineer look like? How can we describe such a person? Basically, if you are looking for characteristics or skill sets, then what would you be looking for? What are the future needs for systems engineering competencies? Are they supposed to be great problem solvers or designers or architects or project managers? And how prepared is our education system to support the SE needs of the government and the industry? And if what's the gap between the industry need and what we see in the academic programs? So the rules of engagement are provided by Joe. He has, he's the master of ceremonies in this academic forum. So the panelists will basically address their questions. And I'm going to let them decide which questions they want to focus on or how many of the questions they want to combine together when they talk about it, because sometimes it's very difficult to, identify exactly on, I will only talk about this and not about that. So I'm going to let them decide that. And the format will be the same as the last session, which is each one of them will talk for 10 minutes, and then we will open up the discussion to the audience. And it's not just questions. We would be looking for participation from all of you in comments and contributing to the discussion. So as I said, I will just go through these 4 slides to kick off the discussion in terms of what kind of engineering environment are we in, and what do we expect the future skill sets and the future careers of systems engineers. I have been very fortunate to be teaching overseas and increasingly being involved in some of the teaching on systems integration in IBM in India. And the version of systems engineering I see there in terms of the roles and responsibilities and the profile of these systems engineers and what they do and who they are, it's very different from what we see in the US or in some of the traditional systems engineering domains. So some of the challenges that the systems engineering educators have to deal with in a increasingly complex systems environment where design and operational context drives the effort of systems engineering, and we still are trying to work within the traditional siloed structure of engineering disciplines. The need to have interdisciplinary focus and have multiple departments and disciplines come together to deliver this thing called systems engineering. You can't just have a program on systems engineering having nothing to do with the other engineering disciplines. That doesn't make sense. The other aspect is this T-type personalities that we've been talking about. The technical depth and the horizontal width of cross disciplines is another challenge. Those of you who were there this morning in the key address, the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned and illustrated the difference between cost of car and the cost of affording and maintaining a car. It immediately comes to my mind that we are working in an environment where a complex system is driven by cost to integrate, cost to maintain, cost to of testing and quality and efficiency and customer related issues. So the cost of the product is not just what we are trying to deliver in terms of what we teach our systems engineering graduates. And then the pressure of time to market, and that the time to market pressure is really compressing our front-end activities of systems engineering, where we deal with design issues and requirements and some of those initial defining activities. And some of the technological trends of, processing, fastening processing times, computing times, global communication networks, and low-cost computing, and R&D, which is globally distributed. I mean, today companies have R&D locations outside of their, pharmaceutical, telecoms companies and IT companies have diversified in terms of moving their R&D locations to countries like India and Indonesia and China. So it's not just that some development work is being done, but even R&D is being done outside. So these are the kinds of challenges for which we need to focus our curriculum differently in how we prepare our systems engineers. These are some of the skill sets that the next generation engineers would be required to have. Again, these are from National Science Board study. So if you look at them, they have moved from problem solving and teamwork, and they have now started emphasizing more on problem formulation. And so it's, and you all know, we all know from experience that problem formulation is really the crux of successful systems engineering. How well can we teach our students to spend more time in analyzing, understanding upfront issues about system functionality, so to be able to formulate the problem, define the problem well. So they are emphasizing problem formulation and moving from teamwork into more influencing diverse teams. So this is not just about working with teams, but being able to influence. And basically the point is, how efficiently can teams work towards a team decision. It's not just about teamwork in terms of where you democratically go about getting decisions and getting the teams involved. So I'm not going to go through all the list, but these slides will be made available for you all. Then the elements of a systems approach. Where do we find and how do we, I think one of the audiences in the earlier session mentioned about the difficulty in teaching systems thinking and the holistic perspective, which is basically what we want to deliver in our systems perspective. So lateral thinking, experiential learning, integration, rather than developing order, it's correlating chaos. Handle ambiguity. So not that you will always have predictability, but it's known that in complex environment there will always be ambiguity. So how do we teach our students to handle ambiguity in teams? Synthesis, formulate problems, implement ideas, societal context, socio-economic, political, legal context of systems. And then the characteristics expected of the next generation engineering graduates. Again, this is also from the National Science Board study. So understand the functional core of engineering process, but at the same time be able to know and analysis and synthesis. Be able to think laterally and vertically again. Be able to communicate effectively to diverse groups and influence decision making. And this one is very important, recognizing the relationship of engineering enterprise to social, economic, political context and and so here's a list of what the National Science Board actually thinks that would be the future engineering careers. Where would they be? Sustainable development will be the focus, not just a one-time development and throw it out there and don't worry about whether it's going to last or not. Life cycle issues, environmental context, green technology, the use of multimedia and computer communications, micro, nano, micro electrical, mechanical systems, mega systems. So for all of us, if we look at this list, how many of these will involve systems engineering? All of them. It's amazing that we can't continue to teach systems engineering expecting that product development and life cycle issues are linear and sequential. All right. So basically, that's all I had to share because I thought that was a good list. And this is what we found. We had, actually, as part of the INCOSE study, these are the 35 university programs that we had studied from a perspective of what they are teaching, how many degrees they have, what do they call, titles of those degrees, and so on and so forth. Okay, so with that, I will let the panelists, share with you their views on which questions they would like to talk about, and their views on whether they think that our academic programs, our engineering education today is prepared or not prepared, and what are those major gaps that we should be, we should plan to address. Professor Okami, would you like to go first?
Microphone?
Yeah, microphone.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay. In Japan, system engineer means either the computer programmer or the mechanic to take care of the computer or server hardware. But this time, somewhat different. The graduate school of the system design and management was established last year, very new, and we have some students here. So I'd like to talk about our experience at Keio University. As I mentioned, in Japan, the system engineering is not well known. So in such situation, the objective of the SDM is to foster a strong leader for large complex project and the creative system designer and also the reliable project manager. These are the target. And the expected competencies for the SDM graduates are somewhat very ambitious. But the program definition and communication and integration will be the key issues among both. Also, the coverage fields of education and research is almost very wide. The product system design and the operation system design and the social system. So the faculty, including some international partners, can be mapped on the V model of this, and we intentionally place these faculties to create roles according to this well-known V model. But some of them are very much discipline-oriented, just that horizontal, vertical of the field. And this is going. But the students are now complaining about this fact that so many methodologies taught in the course of these QPM, QFD, the KG diagram, mind map, and so on. So now we are arranging our courses more, become slimmer and more understanding. And so these are now underway. So, but below this kind of the system engineering based methodologies, there are some deeper layer which should be taught beforehand to the students. Just like the fundamentals of the probability theory or the control theory, mechanics, and so on. So these are also very much diversified. So the arranging of these things with the methodology related to SC, systems engineering, are quite involved. We are now doing this. And in addition to this, it is important for the student to learn or to do some exercise according to this methodology. Just not listen to the professor's lecture. And half of them will get sleep sometimes, according to the George's presentation. So, and for this, we have asked some professors from the overseas, from Stanford, from MIT, and from others, to do very extensive exercise works. And this is twofold. That's exercise itself is very important. Also, the communication in English is also very important. So this is a workshop style covering about extending about half one. But what the industry would expect is somewhat different. That's what the some of the plant engineering company people depicted, what they expect to this. And the leadership is very important, but in addition to that, the knowledge of wide spectrum, including IT skills and human skills also. And they emphasize that creativity is very important. And also, what they asked us is the tailoring of the courses. Some of the engineers are very experienced in some field, so they don't have to take this course or that course. But for the other person, that course will be very, very important. And also maybe this is skip. And another example is the Toyota's Prius development. It's somewhat different topics. But one of our professors did come from the Toyota, who was in charge of developing the core driving element of the Prius. And he told me some story about the development of the Prius. And what he mentioned is somewhat very basic principle of system engineering. Because the most important thing is the top management. Actually, the president of Toyota decided to continue to do some research on the electric vehicle, even though there's no Prius, no hybrid vehicle, and the battery is huge, motor is not so good, but still continue to do R&D on the electric vehicle, because in the future, or in the near future, electric vehicle will become very important. So in so doing, there's some strong issues on the environment, the carbon, the oxide issues. Then this R&D has been accelerated, and that involves many other departments. And there's the CE, Chief Engineer, which corresponds to Project Manager. And he was named, and he has a very strong voice and power against the personnel or the funding and everything. And at some point, the deadline of the development has been assigned. So after that, there's some research facility at the foot of Mount Fuji, it's the eastern part, and Toyota is the central part of Japan in an area. So they are going back and forth very often. And this part is for production, this part is R&D. So they made a very great effort. And finally, the final travels. Of course, there is a very strong support from the software engineer, so-called embedded software system. Anyway, my feeling was that the culture was very important, and the Toyota's culture, just like Panasonic, is the same, the customer first. place of being on site. Touch the real artifacts at the spot. Just leave the desk, go to the factory, touch the real thing. And the team is normally located in the big room, so if the CE, chief engineer, speak loudly, all the engineers can hear simultaneously. So there's no delay in communication. So that's the most way of the most the Japanese company did. However, some issues of the system engineering education, there's still a gap between industry expectation and what our SDM can provide for. And the second is there's some weak point for non-engineering students in the fundamentals of very important technology or the science, the knowledge. And number three is, as I mentioned, there are too many methods and tools, which is not so, let's say, well arranged yet. And number four is just like myself, the English is not so good, so this is a barrier for students and instructors in communication. And final issues may occur when the economic situation is getting even worse. Then R&D becomes very going down. Yet our SDM will proceed by trial and error. So please watch what we are doing now. So that's a long-term plan extending to 2020. Fortunately, our program is funded by the government, Ministry of Education, for 5 years studying from last year. Thank you very much.
I went ahead and tried to address some of the questions, each of the questions, but the notion of an engineer, what distinguishes an engineer is, I like to say that a systems engineer engineers about engineering. But in some ways, as I was reflecting on this, that seems inadequate for the 21st century. But as I try to explain in various circumstances, it's that f of x, it's the transfer function. And that transfer function happens whether or not there's systems engineers with titles involved or not. And it happens to different degrees in different environments in different ways. And understanding that transfer function in your environment is different. The notion of applying basic systems engineering concepts sort of ubiquitously. So life cycle, the concept of a life cycle applying to a requirement, an enterprise, a system, all types of aspects, applying it in a way that you're not rigid or bound yourself. And one of the things that I struggle with in engineering, and I have this on the next slide, is the notion of rigidity in thought. There was a criticism by Joe about the standards and the notion that there's some formula that you apply in a step-by-step manner, and that the processes indicate that, say, standards and processes are necessary but not sufficient, and I think all of us understand that. But it's more that mindset that seems to have a grasp of some core concepts and can apply them, in a understanding the environment that they're applying them in. The notion of less ego. When I teach concept definition, which is my particular passion, is I have the students repeat, it's not about me. And engineers too often get wrapped up in that somehow this product is about them, and it isn't. And as teams, that notion of egoless design and the notion of a honest broker are critical. And you can feel that in a team, and you can feel that sense of rigidity and the notion of ego investment if it exists in product. Strong mental model for me is critical, and that gets back to the other one, implying some core concepts. Flexibility in applying, based on language or based on culture or based on sort of what I call a constraint envelope. And when I say culture, I'm not talking just national culture, I'm talking cultures and organizations, is that you understand sort of those things that need to be applied, and you quickly evaluate what's going to be going to give you the highest pay back, given that anything you introduce is going to disturb a culture, and that notion of one size fits all and making people do something that you believe rigidly has to be done, you're bound to fail. And Sandia is one of the most recalcitrant organizations on the face of the earth, and so to change that environment, it's not easy. And so that mind, the ability to have a strong mental model about systems engineering and sort of the core concepts in systems engineering, and to be able to observe the landscape and make the appropriate assessment given the culture and the politics to what you can change first and where you can apply systems engineering, and not in a way that you feel like it has to be done this way, my way or the highway kind of thing. So these are just future competencies, and these are just a brainstorming, and some of them overlap. But one of the things that I often say, and particularly working for national laboratories, is that we have some of the brightest and the best, and yet we're focused so much on technologies and widgets, and we have such an opportunity in truly defining and understanding the complex problems that exist in society today. But most of our engineers have not been taught that problem definition skill set. And so while we get engineering students from some of the top universities with 3.8s and above, they have GPA requirements and everything, I often say they're a bunch of row your boat. They can't play row your boat. They're a bunch of maestros, and so that they struggle with defining the larger problem. And this is a generalization, not all of them, obviously. So one of the things as I was reflecting is the characteristic of engineers that we need are also characteristics that we're defining for our systems, which is interesting. We try to talk about robust systems, adaptable systems. They're complex but not complicated. And you can apply that to the engineer too. And so it's kind of interesting that the words that we throw out about our systems and that we want for our systems is true about what we want for our engineers as well. How prepared is our education system to support our systems engineering needs? True depth systems engineering experts are difficult to find. At least we struggle to find true systems engineers that can actually do the things that I talked about, and that do not have that rigid mentality and can assess a situation and know how to progress the systems engineering without being in their own way. One of the things that drives me crazy is that, I think in many ways the software engineering people are going to get ahead of us, because in software engineering, in the computer engineering curriculums these days, they have to take 2 semesters of software engineering. In mechanical and electrical, they don't. They're so widget. Most of them are widget focused, very much technology focused. There is a NAVED accreditation, for instance, with a capstone project. I think that capstone, that year capstone, should be taught by the systems engineering department with assistance from the mechanical or electrical. Because right now, they're coming out without that knowledge, and it's difficult for a systems engineer, even if you had a couple of good ones, to convince them that broader picture is important. Wicked problems, in reflecting about the next century, I'm in the nuclear weapons business, and thinking about the global situation when it comes to nuclear weapons is a complex and a wicked problem. Thinking about border control, I live in New Mexico, and the whole notion of immigration is a wicked problem. And one of the things that I found that is anti-systems engineering, and yet we do it all the time, I even see systems engineers or people that call themselves systems engineers do it, is to define a nice closed boundary that they can control. So if they can't control it by their whatever concepts they have around systems engineering, they just draw in the boundary so they can. And pretend that everything else outside that boundary doesn't exist. And that's essentially what we've done. People talk about systems. I say we've always dealt with systems. It's just that our aperture was so small that we focused on the widget. But that's why we're in the condition we are right now with the sustainability in this globe. My daughter works in environmental engineering. She says, "Mom, we designed chemicals years ago so that they wouldn't decompose and break down. Guess what? They don't decompose or break down." And so now, so there was another system in play, but we just did not open our aperture. And then this notion of emergence, again, I look at the younger culture, and people have a tendency to criticize the younger culture. And yet, I'm often in awe of them because they are non-hierarchical. They are able to deal with uncertainty. They are multiplexing at a rate that most of us cannot multiplex. We are on a verge of a new world, in essence. And we don't understand that world, and we keep trying as engineers to redefine the world in a way that we can understand it. And it's not like we've done
everything I'm about to say. Most of what I'm going to say depends on context, and my claim would be that the expectations we have on system engineers is highly context dependent. So depending on the organization, the relationship between the project management and the system engineer, the culture, the nature of the challenge, the life cycle phase, the requirements for that system engineer change drastically. So our question is, one of them is, what are the capabilities required? And if we have a group of system engineers here, I'm sure we can talk about what capabilities are required until tomorrow, if you like. The list that's up there, we won't even go through all of them, but imagine, this was probably 4 years now, and far, NASA and DoD got together, and the question was not so much what are the competencies, but we took about 20 crusty system engineers and said, what does a good system engineer have to be able to do? And so got very specific about those capabilities, and those are listed there on the left. And then over the next 3 years, we spent time sitting with different organizations and asking them, we created a little tension, asked them to identify their top 12 priorities given their organization structure, the way they work, the kind of problems they work. And the colors here, I've got 4 performance levels, and performance level 1 is, imagine this represents a person that's on a system engineering team, isn't running the team, but does analysis, supports what's going on. Level 2, this is a fully functional system engineer that has the right capabilities, knows their processes, can do the job at, say, a subsystem level. Level 3, imagine a program level system engineer that's got multiple system engineers working for them with subsystems or the like. And then level 4 is, say, the chief engineer of an organization. For example, Mike Ruskevich, the chief engineer of NASA. And what got to be real interesting is when you sat with these 47 organizations and you said, okay, let's do performance level 2. You get their crusty system engineers and sit down, and the real deep blue there under level 2 represent the critical capabilities for that particular level. And over quite a few organizations, I'll try not to get you too clear what the consistency was almost overwhelming. Now, if you went through the blue list, there are actually 16 critical capabilities at that level 2 across these organizations. If you then go to level 3, which is a program level person, you'll notice that just in these first few, there's a different focus, a different set of priorities and critical capabilities to do their job. Not to say they don't have to know what's going on at level 2. And then once you get to that level 4, you see yet another difference in what the critical capabilities are. And so that makes sense to me anyway, but I'm an Aggie, so I'm a little slow. But at the actual working level, there are a set of skills and capabilities that someone needs in order to do the job. And if we're going to lead a group of folks like that, it's a different set of capabilities. So given that, that's sort of the guidance that we have. And now if you can imagine taking this that comes from industry and government and saying, okay, how do we create a program that provides capability? Not so much education, but capability. And that's sort of how we've gone about trying to orchestrate our program, is each course, per se, has to deliver certain capabilities. And then depending on the group, they may get a totally different experience in their education depending on the level at which they propose to work. So, does academia meet the needs of industry and government? And my claim is yes, sometimes, but not as often as we'd like. So what we've done is introduced context, performance levels. There's some capabilities up there that are fairly well defined. And the real challenge is for us in academia to truly create a program that provides the capabilities at the right level, at the right time. And if you take one item there just for fun, since we all know trade studies, how would trade studies be different at any one of these levels? Just to drive this point home. At level 2, the claim is a person should be able to articulate a trade that needs to be done, find the independent parameter, figure out which parameters to trade against, which options to do the work, present it, and be able to go from there. At level 3, imagine across the program,
to be able to identify all the trades that need to be done across many elements, prioritize those, orchestrate the trades, and assimilate everything that's learned from that activity. And at level 4, the governance, the guidance that's used to actually drive trades and what's done and how. So it's a very different set of requirements for academia, depending on who we're trying to cater to. Okay? So I'll be quiet.
Don't have slides.
Yes.
I was on the workshop room yesterday. Question, what will a system engineer for the 21st century look like? In the context of globalization and a global knowledge economy, the system engineer will be part of a diverse, complex, and even an intellectual workforce. And in that context, the system engineer will have to have the competency to navigate across cultural, social, and intellectual boundaries. Today, the system engineer is challenged by interdisciplinary teams. Well, in the future, they'll still have that challenge, but the other challenge will be developing systems that have integrated multiple engineering and science disciplines. We heard a little bit about it this morning when we talked about the human and the technology and the smart systems, smart voice, smart communication, and the maturity of the nanoscales. They're pulling together different disciplines that we can't even begin to imagine in the future. So those system engineers in the future will have to develop those type of systems and still deal with some of today's challenges as well. The other thing, the system engineer, we talk about the complexity of the operating environment. We talk about its turbulence, emerging behaviors. Well, all of that in that type of operating environment, it just says that the problems that will generate out of that operating environment will be of the same characteristics. And Gina talked about the wicked problem. Well, they don't have to be solved, and we cannot solve those problems the way we do today. We come up with the engineering fix. The system engineer of the future will have to have the capability to do the research. And they have to research very complex information. The volumes of information will be probably magnitudes more than what they have to deal with now. They have to be able to filter through that information and navigate that information so they get to that relevant information for solving that problem. Or as Rossi pointed out, that process would be the problem formulation, is to get through all of the data that's out there. And again, the data will be just as complex as the problem to solve. And then the other criteria that characteristics the system engineer of the future have to have, because once we've formulated the problem, then we have to come up with new solutions. That's where innovation comes in. They have to be more innovative. We can't apply old solutions to these new problems. Innovative solutions will give us the competitive edge to compete in the world, in the global market. Question? how our system engineering needs of the 21st century will be different. Faster, fastest. Everything about system engineering has to be done faster. Processing information, the key, has to be done faster. Engineers will have to be able to process information in uncertainty. They have to be able to process information when they don't have all the information. Well, come up with a solution without having complete information. They have to feel comfortable in those environments. System engineers of the 21st century will look at this data from a holistic perspective. They will be able to identify or recognize patterns within that information and see also in that information the multiple concepts that make up that information. And what I just described to you is a system engineer who uses their intuitiveness to solve problems. And that's the 21st century. The question is, well, how prepared is the U.S. education system to support system engineering needs of government and industry? Well, the U.S., let's put it like this. We talk a lot about the turbulent environment, the complexity, the rapid technological changes. And when you deal with that type of environment, you can almost say probably a good 90% or more of all systems will have to go through some type of reform to operate in that kind of environment. And the U.S. educational system is no exception. And it is one of still the best systems in the world. But in recent years, we can begin to see through results that there is some changes and improvements that have to be made. We know that the educational system isn't producing enough engineers. And therefore, we know it's not producing enough system engineers. And you have to educate engineers in order to produce engineers. So that's why this educational system becomes very critical. That it becomes critical not only to the U.S., it becomes critical to the shaping of globalization. The U.S. educational system has always supported multinationalization. We've used the minds of the world to produce innovative products, which has kept us at the leading edge. And that is why the educational system has to go through, has to be reformed. But the educational system is old, bureaucratic. There's a lot. It sounds like the organization I work for. There's a lot of constraints in there, a lot of issues to deal with, political, social, cultural. It's not going to be an easy thing to transform, but it has to be transformed. But it has to be transformed. Like I said, everything is predicated on the health of the U.S. educational system in this global environment. The other question is how does the current crop of academic system engineering degrees really meet the needs of industry and government? Well, I can say yes and I can say no, because when you're talking about industry and government, they're just so diverse. Their missions, their purposes are so diverse. And you'll have companies on one end who might not even realize that they have a need for system integration. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you'll have companies who are actively strategizing to be the global leader, and they understand the need and the purpose of systems engineering. So, on the one hand, those companies who really know that they need it, I would say, yeah, academically, they're meeting their needs. It's just that the companies, they have to come along to meet the academic world. On the other hand, the other companies, they are pushing the envelope. And the good thing is that on that end, there always will be a gap. And some might even argue that the gap is what you might call progress, because as the company pushed the envelope, academic world, they close the gap. But then a new innovation, a new technology widens the gap, or even creates a whole new gap. And the academic world responds to that, close the gap. The question isn't about how far the gap is, but how fast can the academic world close the gap. And one of the things that is happening today is there's a lot of partnerships and relationships between both worlds. And the idea is to maintain as close a closed gap as possible.
Paul, your turn.
I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to start with how are the needs of the 21st century different, because I think that sets the stage for the things that follow. And I agree with many of the comments made earlier, so I'll try and spend less time on those, but just reinforce a few points. I think it will be pervasive, globally distributed development. It won't be an unusual thing. It will be pervasive. What does that mean? There's implications for communications. If we're still using natural language, it's even part of it. But there will be natural language communications required. I think it's going to give rise to a much more model-based method to try and remove some of the constraints that were applied by natural language applications just because of the global diversity. I think there'll be cultural sensitivity issues that we need to get a lot smarter and more competent with than we are today. And the other thing that comes to my thought in a long globally distributed environment or development concern is we've got two paradigms. We've got trust, which has to be there to some level, but you have to also appreciate that trust has got limits on it, and there'll be certain things that we'll want to safeguard just because they're IP or somebody paid for them, and we don't want to lose all of that. So how do you safeguard that when we're doing pervasive global-based development? Better control, better methods for doing that. And I'm not talking just ITAR kind of things. I'm really talking more about IP kind of things. I believe the 21st century is going to drive us to more versatility in our system engineering workforce. And by that I mean, I don't think with the cost constraints on development and the limited stomach the customer has these days for development type programs, I don't think we can afford to have, I'm just a requirements guy, I'm just an INT guy, I'm just a this. I think we have to have people that are more competent across the range of system engineering skills, because we won't have the ability to maintain a highly specialized set of I turn screws the left-hand guy, I'm the right-hand guy, and somebody else is the pliers guy that holds the nut behind the screw. Those days, I think, are past. There's going to be many new domains. If you think about it, genetic engineering is an area that's ripe for the application of system engineering techniques. Some of those techniques we don't even have today, but certainly it's a problem space where it could add value. Finance, we heard a bunch of talk today about societal kind of problems, which are big and very complex, which probably will beget some development in techniques and methods. So with that said, let's move to what are the skills? What does the SE look like in the 21st century? Well, I think they're versatile. They have to be. They're going to have to be a whole lot more savvy than most of our system engineers are today with software development and software methods and techniques, because I think all of us know the relative allocation of functionality is more and more towards the software than it is the hardware. Not to say you can be totally ignorant on the hardware, because the software's got to run on hardware, right? It doesn't run on software. So having some architectural experience to be able to do those kind of partitionings and understand the sensitivities of those partitionings would be a key skill. We talked about model-based competency. I think that would be a big deal. There's an increasing emphasis, from what I've seen, on affordability. When we talk about total affordability, not just if I buy this particular software application today at this cost, I save you $150 per copy, and end of trade study. I think it goes much further than that. And what our customers are looking for today is a sensitivity to the total cost of ownership of a particular product that's developed, and it's more than just the initial purchase price. A lot of our system engineers have problems with that level of thinking in terms of what the implications are to the design. How do we do, they have to, in my mind, along with this distributed business and better software skills and probably more sensitivity culturally, I think they're going to have to be more articulate. And it means more than just good technical writers, although that would be a blessing as well. You know, the ability to actually deliver more effective presentations using new media to very, very broad audiences. To do a better job of convincing the program manager that you need another man-month to get something done on the front-end study of the program, and be able to argue that with conviction and get the money that you need. And I don't see enough of that in today's curriculum. Those things are viewed as more soft skills, and we tend to push them off as soft skills, and I don't think they're soft skills at all. I think they make a big difference on the effectivity of the system engineering. So next topic, future SE competencies. I believe there is good work, widely talked about some. I know there's other pockets of work on competencies. If we believe that some of the things I said are going to be true in the further out in the 21st century here, they can be factored into that competency set. There's time to work that. And that competency set could then establish some new requirements for the educational programs that go behind them, so you can develop those competencies. So finally, is the educational system ready to support these needs? I agree with Wiley. I think we hit it sometimes, but I just talked about a whole bunch of things that I don't think we're addressing very well today in most of the curricula that I've seen. We've spent some time in INCOSE. Rashmi's done a bunch of that work in the past on looking at reference curricula for system engineering programs. Think for a moment back to the global distributed environment. We're going to be doing development across the globe. You got system engineers from the east to the west, and how do we put not necessarily lockstep consistency in those curricula, but pull out the important pieces that need to be consistent in the curricula in all those different countries, so that system engineers are globally capable. They understand how to work in a globally distributed environment, and we're given enough insight into some of the methods to be effective with that. System engineering thinking is a pet peeve of mine, because I think we've talked a ton about system engineering thinking or systems thinking, and I've argued for some time, and every time I look around and see this program or that program that's going in the ditch, I get more and more vocal about this. I think systems thinking is a paradigm that we really need to do some work on in the education world, because it isn't just for system engineers. It's got to be for all engineers. I would maintain it needs to be for scientists as well as engineers. And you know what? How about the program managers for a change, so they can start thinking more coherently? And when our guy tries to talk to the program manager's got some appreciation for what he's talking about. I think you're missing a big opportunity there, and that's one that I think would have high payoff. I really do. interdisciplinary is what system engineering is all about. And we just talked about 3 major areas there: that's science, engineering across the board, and program management. I've seen a few examples of truly interdisciplinary capstone projects, bachelor's or master's level program, but not very many. And when we try to educate engineers that we expect to be reasonably productive when they get to the workforce in industry or government, I think pushing that thought of interdisciplinary interaction, so there's people from all of those different areas, finance, program management, and the technical community, that learn while they're still in the university what it's all about to work together on an integrated team on a project. That would add a lot, really add a lot in terms of making the graduates more useful to industry on day one. And pushing the thought just maybe one step further, there is work that's currently underway, as many of you know, on more integrated curricula for systems and software, for example. There's actual funded work on that right now. I think don't stop there. I mean, that's an important area to go, but don't stop there. Come back to my thought about why system engineering is important in all of the engineering fields, not just system engineering. So that's my 2 cents worth from the sweep up group.
All right. With that, we open the discussion to the audience and we take questions. Elizabeth?
Just a quick comment, Paul, at the end of your talk. I would perhaps add legal issues. When you have teams of engineers developing systems across country, it has become very useful for them to have some understanding of intellectual property, to have some understanding of the differences in the regulatory frameworks. And so much so that where I come from, which happens to be Stanford, we have created a common degree with the law school because it had become apparent that it would be helpful.
Okay, good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
First, thanks to all of you. That was a very challenging panel to listen to. I think after listening to both the morning and the afternoon, there's no question in my mind, at least, that one of the resolutions that we made in the earlier session, I should say, was that definitively one-size systems engineering will not fit all. So I think you folks did a really great job. Certainly interdisciplinary also, which factors into our definition from INCOSE, is something that I know we've been trying to encourage more and more. And as Paul said in his final comments, there are some programs, and I think Yoshi's SDM program, certainly with the number of tools and things that were shown there, indicated that it's challenging for the students. It drives them crazy, but it is unfortunately what they need. I think the bit that I found hard to integrate as I was listening to the many different viewpoints was that the systems engineer of the future will be a person who may face a number of different types of problems. So there will be systems engineers who will be facing the problems that are more traditionally the same as those that we discuss on a more day-to-day basis today, further improvements and innovations in products, etc. I think, though, that these wicked problems that were also brought forth will require a different skill set. And I think, again, just as the definition of systems engineering will not require, will not ever become focused down to a single definition, similarly, the skill sets will have to be flexible enough for the type of problem. So as an example, I don't recall which speaker this was, but they were talking about the systems engineer coming up with new solutions. But if you're dealing with a wicked problem, the systems engineer cannot be the one who comes up with a new solution. The best you can hope for is a systems engineer who's creative enough to draw out the ability from the stakeholders who are facing the consequences of this wicked problem to help them to evolve to a solution that takes them forward and into a better place where they are. And also being willing to be patient, because many times now I think, we think, oh, we come up with a problem. I mean, even if we say trade-offs or whatever we say to kind of soften that, we all think solution. Ta-da, solution. And the real world just doesn't work like that. I mean, we're really going to be talking about systems engineers making serious contributions to the betterment of social programs, et cetera. We're going to have to be adding patience to that capability list. We're going to have to be adding more ability to facilitate. Folks did talk about communications, but it's going to be communications even at a whole level that we're not doing now, the ability to extract cooperation and collaboration between parties. So these things are going to be very, very important. And we're not really going in the social systems arena to be talking about coming up with faster solutions, but we are going to have to be talking about a mental agility, a faster mental agility to come to understandings of what multiple stakeholders are saying, even though they're coming at it from highly contradictory viewpoints, helping that group to understand the integration of these multiple viewpoints so that they can understand each other, which will be the only way they will eventually start to move toward compromises that will lead to things that, again, getting away from the words like solutions, but just talking about betterment of the situation from where they are today to later. So I think you folks did a really great job. It certainly spurred some thinking for me, and I really thank all of you for that.
Anyone wants to add to that, or yeah, sure. Yeah.
Hi. Cecilia, I want to thank you for your comment. And you're right, when it comes to the whole innovative process, one would have to take in, who am I doing this for? And I think that came up this morning's session, that as system engineers, we don't effectively communicate with the stakeholder, to even educate the stakeholder to why that requirement cannot be made, and do it in a way that you're even educating the stakeholder. So coming up with the process of coming up with an innovative solution would involve all those kinds of things that you would put on the table about. Thank you.
Of course, Cecilia's work is something that I've followed because it's similar extension of what I've done my work in, and that notion of patience and drawing out. I kind of have a philosophy about solutions, or I know that's a tough word, but it's that who is it, Picasso, Michelangelo, where you just chip away what shouldn't be there, and the solution comes to bear itself. And that it does require patience, and it does require understanding of viewpoints, and more astutely understanding where you don't have a viewpoint represented, which is a difficult part. And without being too controversial, I think women tend to do it better than men. That there's a necessity to come guns drawn in the male, more so than women, and I work with a group of people that our highest issue in nuclear weapons is the notion of security. And I tell, when I teach systems engineering or requirements engineering, I said, if you introduce a solution too quickly in that environment, you open a hole. And you just cannot do that. It's dangerous these days in the level of complexity that we have to come without thinking of the whole problem. So.
And that's why the competency is to do research. Do the research and formulate, do the problem formulation before you get into how do I go about solving that problem.
Okay, Gary, and then we can do.
Gary Langford. The system engineer of today is a cowboy. They are the entrepreneur that comes up with solutions that everyone likes in the local dynamics of the domain. The system engineer that talks about these things in the future will not be a systems engineer. Because you still need the cowboys to come up with the domain solutions. but you need an engineer, a systems thinker, biologist, physicist, any discipline, multidiscipline, that has the principles and general systems theory that they apply to question all the assumptions. They need a new tool set. Tool set's not available to the systems engineer. It's a different mode of thinking. So I think the system engineer of tomorrow is someone else.
That's a very interesting comment. So I think I would like to open this up for further discussion in terms of we are not talking about incremental improvement. We are talking about a complete redefinition of what we are going to be teaching and who are we supposed to be preparing for the next generation. So sure, Regina, you were saying something? No, I agree. Okay. So why don't we have some more questions on that, Robert and
Robert Halligan, Project Performance International. The panel has addressed a changing world, and in doing so, it's looked at the new characteristics required of systems engineers. What it hasn't addressed is any shortfalls that are possessed today, which presumably will carry through and still be capabilities that will be, if they're needed today, will be needed in the future. To express my experience in training thousands of engineers, I find 4 major shortfalls that are doing our projects, doing our companies, doing our government enterprises enormous harm. Firstly, graduate engineers have very little ability to distinguish between problem and solution, meaning that there is no objective basis for judging success. There is no way of knowing what can and can't be changed as the problem changes. Secondly, the level of skills in establishing the quality of problem definition needed, being able to measure what we have, and being able to do the work to determine what we have, if it's not adequate, into what is adequate, is very low. Thirdly, the level of skills in specification writing is unbelievably low, and it is not improving. And then fourthly, there is very little ability, I find, in graduate engineers in general, with, of course, a few percent exception, very little understanding of the fundamentals of logical and physical design and how they relate to one another. Unless we solve those problems today, we are going to be in a bigger mess in the future. That's not to say that I believe it's all gloom and doom. I think we have some pretty good accomplishments as well, but we could do so much better. Would the panel care to comment?
I agree on everyone. and like I sort of said that the processes and those, and I know Joe took a shot at them, but those core competencies are necessary but not necessarily sufficient for the future, and I agree with you. We can keep a lot of people like yourselves very employed just teaching those basics in companies because they just don't seem to catch hold. But I think that goes back to the way we're teaching our undergrad engineers.
So, talking about the pressure of shortfall, one of the things I thought of as a shortfall was that an answer to the question about once you get your degree. Well, as we all know, that once you get your degree and maybe you went to the best of school and you do come out with a degree with all competencies, but after being in the working world, with things changing so fast, that knowledge erodes very quickly. And so to fill that gap, one of the shortfalls is how we teaching our students to be lifelong learners. And is industry setting up continuing education supporting that? Continuing education. I mean, those two components have to exist in this changing environment that we're talking about.
I largely see industry putting graduate engineers through engineering education programs as they recruit them. I look forward to the day when I no longer have a job. I do not want that to continue.
Well, that's what we have at the FAA, System Engineering Educational Program, that we educate our employees. And they have become the best to educate because they already know some things, but you're filling in the gap, and it doesn't take a lot to get them to perform at a higher level. So, at FAA, we work on that.
Okay, let's
my question and the comment have been stimulated by reacting to the two presentations at the end of the table. Professor Kami presented a slide which showed one of the most successful technological programs in the whole history of human civilization, and that's the Prius, which was designed in 9 months. And I contrast that with the catastrophes that Paul is well familiar with in the aerospace industry. The programs, the Boeing, the J-35, which were distributed, not collocated but distributed. Given the horrible level of education that we have in this country, and probably in other countries too.
Which country?
United States. Total inability to formulate sentences. The present programs, which are distributed enough, run into difficulties one after another. It's almost a certainty that a distributed program will go over budget, over schedule. Not distributed, collocated programs run beautifully, and we have had a fantastic history of such programs in the United States. Skunkworks, Jack Northrop's, you know all of the names. So the doubts that I have is, shouldn't we in education preach a different religion, not distributed programs, which is serving corporate interests, but serving the interests of taxpayers, the cheapest programs that can do the job. And those certainly are not distributed ones. And don't we owe some honesty to our students of comparing, good programs from the past to the ideologically good corporate programs that are catastrophes? So I would love to hear your comment.
Let me get some clarification on that. So you were saying that based on these examples, co-location is better than distributed.
Absolutely so. Absolutely.
And the hypothesis is that distributed leads to higher probability of failure.
We almost it's a certainty. Almost a certainty.
Okay. Let you react to it and share my perspective.
I should add some words on that. If the scale of the project is to a certain limit, collocation is possible, feasible. That's a good example is the Prius. But in case of, for example, bullet train, that's another very successful project inside Japan. But the Japanese consortium failed to get a job in China, because of the scale of the bullet train is much larger than that was experienced in the inside Japan. So that depending upon the scale. So if the scale is to a certain limit, the collocation is the best answer. But we have to devise some better procedures and methodologies for distributed cases also.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yes.
I don't know if it is a comment, but let me pose it this way. We all talk about innovation and education, and we're all thinking about our classical framework and the work that we were educated. Innovation isn't that hard. You leave the young people today do whatever they want to do with the guidance of the experience and all of that. And they create the social networks. They create new innovative ways. We don't really need to teach them. We need to guide them through a process. And unfortunately, in the discussions that we'll have, it seems to me that we don't want to accept that technology has overcome many of our educational framework. And we are reluctant to change. We are reluctant to let the young people bring their ideas out and work with us with the experience in the different projects. So it is not that hard. I see, I'm at University of Texas, we have the systems engineering program. in all the classes we have a project. And with the project we work with the industry. And we let the students in teams work whatever way they want. They want it distributed, they want it face-to-face, they want a teleconference, whatever way they want to do it, and use the tools that they know and we don't. And we pretend that we got the tools and the methods. It is a completely different world. And we are not facing that challenge. It is not only in the systems engineering, it's all over the educational. We don't have engineers. Why don't we have engineers growing as they grew in the 20th century? The problems that the youth face today are not Newtonian, as we were taught. We were taught A is greater than B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. And that's the way that we think, that's our environment, that's how we grew. The youth today, all the young people are thinking in a very different way. And we pretend to put them within this framework of education that we know of. So we need to open up, not only systems engineering, the educational system all together. Okay? So I don't know if it was a comment or an opinion, but that's what I wanted to mention. Okay?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there's two examples that come to mind where the youth were allowed to make a difference, make a significant difference. And one was in the election of President Obama. If it wasn't for the youth, their innovation, and being free to exercise that, I think we're going to have a different president. Right? I think even with the election, the Iranian election, and all the disturbance with the young people who went through all the various technologies and they started exploiting Twitter. I don't know a lot about this stuff, but I know that they exploited Twitter so that it was being used in a way that was never intended it to be used. So, yeah, I agree with you totally. And even in my workshop, they're bringing in young people, but we still have managers, supervisors, who's afraid to let them experience. Because like you say, they're looking at it through the lenses of their own educational experience.
And their own experience.
Yes.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Great. But I would like to explore what tomorrow's system engineering.
Okay, last question. Let's get to Tim.
Well, I think I'd like to make a comment rather than a question. But I think part of it comes to our philosophy of what education is about. Is education about giving a space in which the student learns, or about telling the student what the student has to know? And if we can think about that in terms of what outcome we want to achieve, do we want to have people who can achieve useful work outcomes as a result of whatever experience they had in the education place? Or is it about the person who is the teacher saying, well, I'm employed to teach, therefore I have to do so many hours of teaching or else I'll possibly get cross at it? Yeah. What is it? Is it getting success in the students becoming the right people, or on the input side?
Defining what that right means. Right.
Yeah, and so somehow being creative to work out what the right educational space is for the student to learn the outcomes that we want.
I think it will depend upon the level, if we're talking about high school versus college versus advanced degrees. How much of it will be descriptive and how much, yeah.
It comes, the word educar, the original word means to bring forth, to uncover. It really does. If you look at the root of the word education, educate. And we don't do that oftentimes. And so we have a very rigid notion. The problem is that measuring a class that I teach when I teach systems engineering in graduate school is I give different, it's template based because I'm trying to cover a lot of ground really quick, but each team does a different deliverable. And the criticism I had is, well, how do you know all of them are ubiquitously getting the same knowledge? And it's like, again, we have to change our paradigm for how we measure as well.
You can say all, yes. We make
All of this great conversation of the last 5 minutes is centered around education versus training. Point number 4, what are the gaps? All I've heard up till the last 5 minutes was we've got to close this gap. We've got to do what industry wants. We've got to prepare the graduates for the needs of industry. If that gap is 0, we ought to really give it some serious thought as to what we're doing vis-a-vis education.
Okay. All right. So with that, let me just wrap up. I had some follow-up thoughts on the discussion about the co-location and distributed. And let me just finish that up and then wrap up. And it was related to the comment that was made before that about those 3 core functions in systems engineering of definition and decomposition and documentation, which Robert mentioned about why we can't do it, it well. So if we think that co-location is the way that the world is going to go, it's not going to happen. So whether it's Boeing or Airbus or whatever, the point is, can we do our problem definition, decomposition, and specifications in a manner that will allow us to do distributed, work? So anyway, with those thoughts, the 4 points that I found that came up again and again in all the panelist discussions was dealing with complexity, problem definition, systems thinker. How do we, prepare our students to be better systems thinker, holistic context, understanding the holistic context, interdisciplinarity, and capability of being able to do research, whether it is continuing education or it is, involving more deeper methods in what we teach. So those are the kinds of points, and then of course the gaps as I extracted from the discussions. The number 1 is our weakness to address contextual, understanding. So contextual understanding, whether it is from the perspective of diversity or environment or industry-specific context, but how do we incorporate in our teaching enough understanding of the context so that all these other versatility and sensitivity and all those other adaptability, those areas can be addressed. So do we understand the context, and at the same time we have to be, be able to do it domain independent. So that's a big contradiction, being domain independent and still be able to have enough depth about the contextual understanding. All right, so thank you for being here and participating in this discussion, and thanks for this wonderful panel. It was a pleasure.
Hi, how are you? Oh, I'm sure it will be. Hey. Yeah, very good. Better. Now that I see you, I didn't know you were out. You are wonderful. Brilliant. I have just now been all the way through.
One was made by a couple of
You're not going to That's all right. That's quite all right. I will always thank you. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. That's very nice. No problem. Yeah, exactly. Tomorrow night, a whole bunch of us go to a Chinese restaurant that's going to be closed, except for us. Do you want to Paul and Annie and or do you have obligations tomorrow?
I don't know yet, but I have to talk to some people. They might decide something different.
Okay, why don't I do this? Why don't I just put you down here as a maybe? If you think you can make it, tell me sometime, anytime tomorrow, and I'll give you the instructions, okay?
No, because they've asked me to do something for the academic forum in Sweden next year.
Oh, yes. You'd be perfect.
It will be different than this one.
Of course, if I said
that we should think that at least half of the people here don't even know English as much as tell him
the other one I
meant it.
Thanks, Paul. But they were all guys. So, you know,
all right.
In the two sessions, they managed to get international and women, but in any one session, they were a little bit lopsided. Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
See you.
I have a good idea.
Yes, I leave Wednesday morning. Tomorrow night, the flight, no flight. Your talk is so good. 3 days. 25th night I fly back. How's the competencies work? Do you think you can come?
Let me check it. Okay.
Yeah, you're not a surgery.